Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Lisa Castillo-Richmond, and I am the Executive Director of the Partnership for College Completion. Welcome to today's discussion on our latest publication, Racial Diversity on Campus After Affirmative Action. I'd like to thank the Joyce Foundation for their ongoing support of PCC's work, which enabled our team to bring this report to fruition. We have a full agenda for today's webinar and a distinguished lineup of speakers on a very important topic. We are discussing the future of racial equity in Illinois higher education in the wake of the Supreme Court's June 2023 decisions on affirmative action. This morning, we released our report on race-conscious policymaking and approaches for institutional equity and diversity, which will be shared in the chat with you to read at your convenience. Shortly, PCC's Director of Policy, Christian Perry, and Senior Manager of Research and Policy and co-author of this report, Mike Abrahamson, will provide us an overview, which will serve as a precursor to our panel discussion. Our expert panel will discuss the ruling, what it means for our colleges, students, communities, and the future of our state. They will take your questions as time permits, and you can put them in the Q&A function at any time during our conversation today. We will also have the two co-authors of our report, PCC Government Affairs Manager Danielle Stanley and Policy Analyst Caitlin Donnelly Power, monitoring and answering your questions throughout the webinar. As this topic is of critical importance to our work, and we would like to hear from you, we will have an optional post-event discussion on Zoom meeting immediately following this hour-long webinar. The link will be shared with you as we conclude. Lastly, for those of you who may not be familiar with our work in Illinois, I wanted to briefly talk about the Partnership for College Completion and our work in the state. The PCC is the only organization in Illinois focused exclusively on providing leadership for a systems-level approach to support college completion and eliminate institutional inequities in higher education access and outcomes. Since our founding, PCC has helped usher in a new urgent conversation on higher education equity in the state. Launched in 2016, PCC has worked to become a partner and a reliable source of information for colleges and universities, advocates, and local and state leaders who want to take action to advance racial and socioeconomic equity and degree completion. PCC lives the partnership in our name. We convene, support, and collaborate with partners working on college completion and economic advancement for historically marginalized Illinoisans. As a result of organizational action, and a confluence of supportive factors and like-minded leaders in the Illinois policy environment and on our campuses, PCC has begun to see significant changes in the relatively short time the organization has been in operation. Today, there is growing awareness and more nuanced discussion about equity in college completion in the state. Our focus is on solutions to ensure every Illinois student who aspires to a college degree has equitable access to a college education at an institution in the state that supports their academic and career plans, regardless of their race, family income, or wealth. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Christian Perry, our Director of Policy, to introduce the Affirmative Action Report.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Christian Perry, and I'm honored to serve as the Director of Policy and Advocacy here at the Partnership. So since our founding, the Partnership has been dedicated to closing racial disparities that exist in college access and completion. We believe doing so is both moral and an economic imperative for the state of Illinois. Given the focus on race-conscious equity and the ruling's impact on higher ed policy and practice, PCC authored this report to offer insights into current policies and practices that contribute to racial inequity and offer some recommendations for dismantling them. We all know why we're here, and the reality is that time is of the essence. We've learned from states that have banned affirmative action policies in the past and the danger that legalistic and over interpretations of the ruling has on students of color. Already, we've seen conservative leaders opportunistically trying to push institutions toward overstanding and interpreting the ruling. We hope that Illinois, which it has so many times in the past, can continue to serve as a beacon of what it looks like to advance racial equity, even in a national environment that is not favorable right now to higher education. So this report makes some recommendations for how Illinois can maintain or expand racial equity in our higher education network in the wake of the Supreme Court's recent ruling. We see this as an opportunity to push forward for equity. We hope this report resonates with the institutions seeking out different perspectives on pathway forward, as well as campus communities, advocates working together to ensure that students of color in particular have what they need to access and thrive in college. We also offer, we're targeting several different audiences here when it comes to institutional decision makers, campus communities, state level policymakers, and legislators and advocates. It's going to take a broad coalition to get what we need to get done in the wake of this ruling. So I'll offer a little bit of background. As you can see on the slide, almost half of high school graduates are Black and brown in the United States, and selective college enrollees represent less than a quarter of that. And at its inception, affirmative action refers to a package of policies emerging in the anti-segregation movement of the civil rights era. When it comes to labor, education, and the military, advocates, lawmakers, and judges saw that there was a distinct interest for all of society to mitigate segregation, bring folks together, and that the United States of America would benefit from such policies. Two Supreme Court challenges later, the challenges that came narrowed how far and how wide institutions could use race, particularly in admissions, but ultimately held that diversity was still a compelling interest for states that had higher ed institutions. Now, despite the fact we all know that white women have been the greatest beneficiaries of affirmative action, the discourse surrounding affirmative action in admissions has long positioned these policies as preferences, particularly for Black students, when the data just doesn't suggest that, which erases the reality of our long legacy and history of slavery, as well as the discrimination that's existed throughout our country. Existing admission policies and practices that feed into myths of selectivity and prestige, test scores and admissions have long been used to justify filtering out students of color. Even at its most robust, affirmative action wasn't enough to close the gaps. It was one of many tools that our society has tried to use to level the playing field, to address for past wrongs. For example, 2 years after California banned affirmative action for you in California, UCLA's Black enrollment dropped to 7% of the total student population to 3.5%. 25 years later, it's rebounded, but not to what it was pre-striking down affirmative action. Next slide, please. So the court's recent decision in the Students for Fair Admissions against UNC and Harvard further narrows how institutions can consider race in admissions. The court ruled that the current race-conscious admissions practices violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, ignoring how that clause was meant to fight for white supremacy, saying that current practices represent a racial preference that discriminate against white and Asian students. The court ruled along partisan lines 6-3 against Harvard and USC's admission efforts to promote diversity. However, it didn't deny their argument that diversity represents a compelling state interest. Next slide. In fact, the court did state that students can still talk about race and how it's shaped their lived experiences, and how institutions can still consider those experiences as they relate to the institution's missions and goals. In his opinion, Justice Roberts explicitly stated that military academies may have distinct interests that are sufficiently compelling. Now, as a veteran, 13 years in the world's finest Navy, I agree that the military does have a need to work harder at filling its officers' ranks with people of color whose lived experience not only make their fellow officers better, but make them better leaders and allow for more junior service members like myself at the time, to see themselves reflected at the highest levels of service. I also think it increases the likelihood for genuine connection that can be made with men and women in uniform from varying walks of life. Now, if that justification that I just gave and the fruit of intentional diversity and inclusion is good for the future defenders of our democracy, how much more so for those who will graduate from some of our country's most prestigious institutions and then begin leading our courts, our Fortune 500 businesses, and institutions that drive society. Already, the ruling has prompted responses from institutions that have ranged from reiterating their institutional commitment to racial equity, which we appreciate, to unfortunate reactionary pulling of scholarships and programs, which even when those actions are corrected, the damage is already done when misinformation is shared with students and families. Some conservative policymakers have called for immediate overhauls of institutional admissions policies, scholarship policies, and even institutional hiring policies. Meanwhile, the Illinois Board of Higher Education, IBHE, the governor's office, and equity-minded Illinois legislators have pledged to continue the work of racial equity in higher education. So this report speaks to how to turn those commitments into real-world change, to more equitably serve Illinois students of color. It dives deeply into how institutions can rigorously examine how their existing recruitment, admissions, and aid policies constrain access for Black and Latinx students. We believe that Illinois legislators need to hold institutions accountable for enrolling and serving more representative populations of students. And the report will get into that. And ensure that public institutions that already enroll more students of color have the funding that they need to serve those students. Now, I'll turn it over to our Senior Manager for Policy, Mike Abrahamson.
Thanks, Christian. So we talked about some of the dangers of this ruling, particularly if it's overinterpreted. But when we think about who's most directly affected, it's important to note that only 7% of colleges said that race is a considerable influence in admissions, and those are the most selective institutions. So many of our recommendations deal with admissions for students of color in Illinois, and for the purposes of this report, we largely focused on the 4 most selective institutions in our state, our 2 private nonprofit colleges and 2 public universities, because they are most directly affected by this ruling. And our first recommendation is for these schools to recruit from more diverse sources, namely high schools and community colleges that are currently underrepresented in their admissions profile. So when we look at, for example, the CPS high schools that these 4 universities mostly draw from, we see that their student profile doesn't look like the rest of the CPS district. And you can see that in these pie charts in the bottom right. They compare the top 10 Chicago public high schools that these universities draw from to the district as a whole. And as you can see from the orange slice of the charts, that these feeder schools tend to enroll far more white students, and the blue slice show they enroll a fraction of the Black student populations compared to the district as a whole. Also, in initial data from public universities, we saw a strong correlation between the percentage of their student body that comes from Illinois' most underfunded high schools and the percentages of students of color on their campus. So both of these data points imply further opportunity for institutions to recruit and enroll students from underrepresented high schools. Similarly, the 4 most selective institutions combined to enroll 73,000 undergraduate students in all, but only accept 250 Black transfer students per year from community college, showing that when considering equitable enrollment, these colleges have not meaningfully looked toward community college transfers. Our report dives deeper into notions of prestige and selectivity and how they can fuel inequity. But I'll say here specifically that we do cite research that shows that community college transfer students can and do succeed at even the most selective schools in the country. The universities that I'm thinking about have the resources to equitably serve these students. They combine for $21.5 billion in endowment value. So recruiting students is the first step, but in the wake of this decision, institutions will have to rethink how they admit students equitably and also what they can do to improve, which is the percentage of students who decide to enroll after being admitted. And when we look at enrollment, we're seeing the product of both where colleges recruit from and their yield. So one big potential step, if a difficult one, would be to de-emphasize early decision. Early decision definitely, it adds some certainty and convenience for colleges, right? But it does so at the expense of equity, as ED applicants are 3 times more likely to be white than regular decision applicants. We also discuss how test blind policies can help not only with equitable admissions, where most people think about them, but also have to be used in aid decisions as well in order to improve diversity and enrollment. That speaks to the yield that I was talking about. And finally, we explored the idea of universities looking at metrics of wealth rather than income when they're determining student aid. So there's a lot of promise here for more equitably distributing student aid using wealth and improving yield and retention. UCLA law demonstrated that when they switched metrics for their admissions to using something based on wealth and income instead of just income, and saw 11 times the number of Black students admitted and double the number of Latinx students. So there are some details that definitely have to be worked out. Institutions have to look at what data they collect, what data they could collect, and how, if and how they can use that information. But there's also a lot of promise in using wealth data. It's not enough to just enroll more students of color. Colleges have to support and retain them. And we detail in the report how wealth building opportunities have been denied to people of color for centuries. That's led, as you can see on this chart in the bottom left, to the average white household having $116,000 in wealth on average, compared to less than $2,000 for Black and Latinx households. And with these differences in mind, when we talk about retaining students of color, we recommend supports first and foremost that make it more affordable for students to attend college. We touch on things such as providing basic needs and offering emergency. And then recommendation for eliminating legacy preference in admissions. It's probably been discussed as much or more than any other possible solution in the last few weeks and months, and that's for good reason, right? It's very inequitable. Some people call it affirmative action for the 1%. And the research and data back this up. For example, 35% of Harvard's white students were the children of donors, alumni, or faculty, and that's compared to 7% of their Black students. And nearly 3/4 of the most selective schools in the country still use legacy preference in admissions. So getting rid of legacy admissions is something that selective institutions absolutely should do. They might be required to do it, pending some of the legal battles happening now. But what we're saying is that to see substantive change, it cannot be the only thing they do. Finally, we have 2 steps that legislators and advocates can take. So first, we have to fund our public colleges and universities more equitably. The state gives universities about half of the funding that we did 20 years ago, with no formula for how funds are distributed. So we're definitely not saying that any university is properly funded or adequately funded. However, with the current distribution, every year that results in about 52% of appropriations from the state going to just 2 universities that enroll the lowest percentages of Black students, with the other 10 universities that serve greater percentages of students of color splitting the remaining 48%. We also know that our community colleges enroll greater percentages of students of color, but they're woefully underfunded. Every year we calculate what colleges need from the state to serve their students, and last year we only funded 23% of that number, and that left colleges and their students to make up the rest. So finally, recommendation 6 acknowledges that it's up to all of us to hold institutions accountable for making these changes. We're inspired by the statements that our colleges, agencies, and legislators have made so far, but they're only as strong as the actions that they ultimately take. And we know these institutions have to consider the public interest, right? But especially public colleges and universities, but private institutions also receive state aid, and they should be able to justify how they're enrolling and serving populations that reflect the state. So with that in mind, we're proud to be in community with all of you as we take these steps toward equity. And I'll pass it over to Dr. Will Del Pilar and our panel to further discuss this ruling and the future of higher education and racial equity.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's wonderful to be here today. My name is Will Del Pilar, and I'm the Senior Vice President at the Education Trust, and I'll be serving as today's panel moderator. But before we dive in, because we don't have a lot of time, I do want to provide a quick introduction of our esteemed panelists. We have Dr. Liliana Garces, a professor at UT Austin's Department of Educational Leadership, Maya Bradziak, Counsel of the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights, and Monty Thomas, who is a recent graduate of Blackburn College and current grad student at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So let's start with Liliana and Maya. Whose voices should institutions be seeking out and listening to when it comes to guidance, student needs, and the impact of the ruling? I'll start with Liliana, and then Maya, if you can also provide some insight.
Thanks, Will. So I'll start by saying that the U.S. Department of Justice and Department of Education earlier this week released important guidance that were outlining the parameters of the decision. And this guidance is grounded in the decision itself. Christian mentioned, a lot of efforts to try to expand the reach of the decision outside admissions and to say that race can't be considered in other areas. But this guidance really importantly clarifies that institutions can still consider race in a number of ways, and within admissions, that they can do so in connection to an applicant's discussion of how race affected their life, how that experience is connected to skills and the knowledge that they bring to advance the institution's mission. And in some respects, institutions need to listen to their own values, to themselves, and to really ground a lot of their actions in their mission, in the role that they serve in contributing to the health of our multiracial democracy. And to double down on their commitment to advancing a quality education for all students, to ensure equal opportunity for all with responses that abide by the parameters of the court's decision, and to not overreact or overcorrect. I would also say they need to listen to the lessons from research, where we've seen other approaches. There's great documentation about how other approaches that don't look at race as even in a limited way are just not as effective, like just relying on socioeconomic status, for example. And that a robust body of work to show that when you don't consider race at all, as we've learned from institutions that are in states that ban the practice, that can really lead to significant declines in student body diversity across a number of educational sectors at selective institutions and graduate fields of study and schools of medicine and law schools and business schools. And I think this federal guidance that was issued this week really outlines very important ways and practices in the report today that can help mitigate those devastating outcomes for higher education and for our nation.
Thank you. And as you said, it's not time to walk away from our commitments to diversity. Maya, as an attorney, can you provide some of your perspective on the decision and who institutions should be seeking guidance from?
Of course. Thank you so much for having me today. I will first second everything that Liliana said. The guidance from the Department of Education, the Department of Justice is a great resource to look at. I'll add that my organization, which represented students and alum in both the Harvard and UNC cases, is also providing materials. And related to that, I'll say one of the areas or one of the groups of people that institutions should be listening to are the students themselves. The students on their campuses know what supports they need in order to feel welcome there. They know what students like them who are hoping to come need in order to feel like they're going to be welcomed and that they're going to belong there. And so I would encourage universities and school and colleges to reach out to those students and see what they say about the best way that those schools can support those students. I'll also add one more note of a group that institutions should not listen to, and that is the groups that are anti-civil rights, like EdBlum and Students for Fair Admissions, that are leading these cases and looking to expand their agenda against civil rights and diversity in this country. You will see that EdBlum has in fact issued a letter to colleges and universities saying how they should interpret the decision. And that letter distorts the truth. So I'll put into the chat, Lawyers Committee actually put together a response to that letter, sort of showing what the true reach of the decision is. It's fairly narrow, it's limited just to admissions, and keeping that in mind. And so showing the ways that Ed Bloom and his organizations and other organizations like his are really sort of pushing a specific agenda, and their interpretation of the decisions is guided by that, and therefore doesn't make for a particularly great resource to rely on.
I appreciate that, and it's a great transition. We have Monty here, who's a current graduate student. And so, Monty, as a current graduate student, why is racial equity in your program and on campus important to you?
I think for me, having like that additional like layer of security will just like help me like succeed in my graduate career. And I know that, well, just today we had a more of like an orientation for our master's program. And I happen, and this isn't the first time, to be like the only Black person in the room. So I think having resources there for minority students, students of color there, and having the faculty personally let these students know that, you know, we're here for you if we need anything, will really help.
Thank you. Liliana, in your first response, you mentioned the importance of seeking out research. And in the literature, what do we see in the literature on the value of diversity on campuses and to students more broadly?
We do have a robust body of research documenting the very tangible and measurable benefits of diversity to campuses, to students, to society, including the fact that a racially and ethnically diverse student body helps build critical thinking skills. It prepares future leaders to lead in a multiracial, multi-ethnic society. It helps break down racial stereotypes. It improves cross-racial understanding. All the benefits to society, including medicine, for example, where racial diversity is critical for improving health outcomes for all, and for just a just multiracial democracy, and that it really helps ensure pathways to positions of power and influence, that those pathways remain open regardless of race. And for almost half a decade, dating back to 1978, the court's past decisions on race-conscious admissions were grounded on this robust body of research, documenting these many benefits and allowing institutions to consider race in a limited way to advance those benefits, which helps institutions provide a high quality education for all students and to advance their role in contributing to a healthy multiracial democracy. That is until now, with this decision, which doesn't explicitly say, but it essentially does overrule 45 years of precedent. And it very clearly sets aside all of the social science research that documents these measurable and identifiable benefits, which, you know, as somebody who's also trained in law, the principle of stare decisis, that is that it's legal precedent, not ideological leanings that should guide the interpretation of law. You know, it's of great concern. And I think that it leads to really that moral imperative and economic imperative for institutions to not expand the reach because it just expands the damage unnecessarily.
Thanks for that. Monty, Liliana had said earlier that you know, institutions, it's not time for institutions to walk away from their commitment to diversity. What advice would you give institutions in communicating to current and prospective students and are showcasing the institution's commitment to diversity on campus?
I'll go. So I know our president here at UIUC recently put out a statement talking about the Supreme Court decision that passed. And the message was that, you know, they aren't able to consider race within admissions, but they are still committed to pursuing diversity on campus. And although I felt like this message was like needed amidst all the turmoil, I kind of felt like it could have been a little bit more, like, you know, exactly what are you doing or going to do to maintain diversity on campus and even increase it? Just like, you know, kind of like putting your money where your mouth is.
Maya or Liliana, I don't know if you guys want to add anything to.
I mean, I
think that is that.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Liliana.
Sorry. Yeah. It's really important what Monty just said, in that, you know, communication is important, but it's about how actions and practices align with those communications. Because what we know from the research is that also, you know, diversity is not just about numbers. It's also about the interactions that students have with one another, and whether they feel valued and welcome on campus. And that really is related to the practices that are in place to facilitate those interactions and to address the racial isolation that can really harm the educational experience.
And I would just really echo what Monty said in terms of institutions putting their money where their mouth is. I think there's a lot that institutions can say, and recognizing that resources are always an issue. It is really important that when you say you're going to be committed to something, really thinking about what programs on campus can be supported monetarily and with other resources to make sure that's going to happen. The other thing that I will add is I think institutions can also start to really reconsider policies and practices that they have that have historically worked to increase the number of sort of white students or already privileged students, such as legacy admissions and test scores, and really think about those programs and how they're impacting and what message it sends to their students of color by keeping those policies in place, even as more and more research shows that they really serve as a barrier to the diversity goals that they say that they have.
Maya, you kind of led to my very, very next question. And so what changes will be most impactful when it comes to expanding recruitment, enrollment, and retention of student of color? And Maya, if you want to go first, and then Liliana to follow up.
Sure. I mean, so I think exactly sort of what my previous answer was. I really think policies and practices need to be re-examined now that this is a great opportunity really for colleges and universities to look at their admissions program sort of in a holistic manner and look at what are policies and programs we have in place that, you know, even unintentionally have made it harder for us to really fulfill our goals towards diversity. I think legacy admissions, as was mentioned in the earlier part of this webinar, are a great place to look at. Reliance on test scores, another great place. And there's also a lot that colleges and universities can do to think about what can they affirmatively do. Looking to community colleges in their areas and thinking about partnerships that they can set up. Thinking even before that, connecting with high schools or middle schools in their areas that could create pipeline programs to support. There's so much that universities and colleges can do. Obviously, the loss of affirmative action as how it existed before is a blow to this sort of work, but affirmative action was never meant to be the silver bullet. It was one tool among many. And I think colleges and universities are in an excellent place right now to really start looking at all the other tools they should have been using. And if they haven't been, now's a great time to start. If you have been thinking about how to make those more robust.
Absolutely. I think everything that Maya said. And, you know, I think here, one other really important consideration is related to how we even conceptualize merit and who is meritorious of admission. So we've talked about how institutions can still use students' experiences in connection to race, and how will they make those determinations, and looking to essays that would allow students to express that for admissions officers. And in this area, I think about this concept of democratic merit. This is a concept that was coined by late Harvard Law professor Lani Guinier. And if we think about admissions as an incentive system that rewards the actions that we value in a democratic society, the ability to cooperate across racial differences, to give back to marginalized communities, to help disrupt racial inequities, then what we think of in admissions, the admissions process should be rewarding students who demonstrate that potential to engage in those actions. That in itself makes students meritorious. These are values that in some ways are grounded in community and not just individual achievement. That's a fundamental transformation that I think is also needed.
Thanks, Liliana. Monty, this ruling may convey an unfortunate message to students of color about belonging on campus and whether they belong on predominantly white institutions. What can colleges do to counter that message and support currently enrolled students of color, but also students of color who may be considering an institution?
So like, you know, those narratives such as like, you're only here because you're a woman or because you're Black or you're a diversity hire. Unfortunately, those are some statements that I've already heard through my undergraduate career. And I think the best way to go about confronting those narratives is for like the president in tandem with the chief officer of diversity at any college to just confront them head on. You know, they should be putting statements out, especially about at this time, considering the Supreme Court ruling that clearly address these issues. to me, like not addressing the issue doesn't make the narratives go away. It just gets the people who believe in them to not really talk about them, especially openly. The prejudice and bias that people have is still going to be there whether we like it or not. And to me, not addressing those issues is kind of the same as being complacent with them.
Thanks for that response. Liliana, we've witnessed states and institutions acting, and Christian referenced this a bit at the beginning, but we've seen them acting in ways that are well beyond the scope of the decision. What do we know from the research from states that banned affirmative action, given some of your work in that space?
Yeah, and I referenced some of this in response to your first question, and that when there's that prohibited consideration of race, we have a robust body of work that shows that racial diversity declines across a number of educational sectors. So I won't restate my points there, but I do think it's important to understand that some of this overcorrection is the result of the broader social political context that institutions are in. We're at a time when attempts to advance equality and opportunity will continue to be challenged by those that have long opposed the practice. And that can lead to responses that are motivated by fear, by just even thinking about the threat of litigation, as opposed to the decision itself, or even just being grounded in your values. And I've seen that in a lot of my research in responses to, for example, when at institutions that could still use race-conscious admissions, that were not in a state that banned the practice. They chose not to in order to protect themselves from potentially the threat of lawsuits. Or responses from administrators, for example, who are working outside admissions. They're there to support the educational experiences of students of color. And they say that they were at institutions in a state that banned affirmative action. And they themselves felt like in the aftermath of those bans, they couldn't even talk about race, even when that work was outside of admissions, which is something that the bans did not cover. And administrators and educators right now might be finding themselves feeling the same way in the aftermath of this decision, which is why it's so important to rely on these balanced interpretations of what the decision says, what it covers, what it doesn't cover, and to act from that moral imperative to advance the educational mission for the institution. I believe that university administrators really want to act in the best interests of students and in their mission, and we need to support their efforts to do so. And part of that requires understanding this broader social political context that we're in that really inhibits those efforts.
Maya, what advice would you provide to states and to institutions, given your reading of the decision and your experience with the two cases?
Yes, I mean, I think the most important thing to know about the decision is that despite the sort of broader context that's been discussed about, the decision itself is fairly narrow. It discusses only admissions, so it does not affect a college or university's ability to focus on diversity in its outreach and in recruitment to increase the number of students of color that are applying to its institutions. It also doesn't affect any DEIA efforts that the institutions might be working on campus to, again, ensure that once students of color and other historically marginalized students are there on their campus, that they feel welcome, that they're able to successfully complete their college programs because they feel secure in their ability to be there, to be welcomed, and to be respected. And again, the decision is just talking about the use of race sort of as it's on its own in a consideration. Students that discuss racialized experiences in their applications, whether it's through essay questions or other means, college admissions officers are able to consider those experiences and what they tell the admissions officer about that student's, character or drive or other characteristics that they're looking for. So there's no way the decision that sort of makes it completely impossible for students, for college and universities to think about race, both even in admissions, but also broader within their communities.
So I'm going to ask one more question. I know folks are using, I think they're using the Q&A function to put questions in. And then we're going to open it up for questions. So I hope throughout the conversation, you've been maybe taking notes and preparing a question or two for our panelists. So given I would say all of the resources that are currently being produced, lawyers committees produce some really, I think, helpful pieces. Liliana, I saw you had a piece in New America that came out, I believe, today. The administration just released guidance. Who should we be following? Who should we be? What resources should we be looking to as we continue to navigate this, this space and this time?
I'm happy to take a first stab at that. So I think, well, all the resources you just mentioned, they're all fairly consistent. So you could really go to any one and I think get a really good idea about what the true scope of this decision is and what colleges and universities can or cannot do in regards to their admissions currently. I would also really encourage schools to reach out to other schools that have been in this position or are already making changes that they're interested in making. Some schools have already announced that they're going to get rid of legacy admissions or that they're reconsidering the use of test scores, reaching out to those schools and saying, hey, we're interested in that. How did you do it? We want to do it. I think, there's a lot of statistics that show that in California, when affirmative action was banned, that it took a long time for those schools to make up those differences. They're starting to make some progress now, which is great, but learning from what those schools did so you can hop in and sort of adopt what they're doing now, so you can hopefully sort of skip the time that it took California and other states to sort of catch up and figure out what to do next. So really sort of also relying on just other institutions that you're familiar with and seeing what they're doing so that you can adopt other successful policies and practices as well. And then I'm sure, Liliana, you know more about this than I do, but looking at the research and figuring out, what is effective.
Absolutely. I think those are all really important pieces. And I'll just add one small point about also there's looking to resources, but there's also the really important piece of engaging in coalition with education and policy organizations like Partnership for College Completion, because those are really important efforts that I think will tackle more directly the broader context that institutions are operating in as they face all these threats. I think those partnerships become really important to counter those external pressures so that they can act in the best interests of their students and really defend their educational mission in the face of these restrictions.
So first question so far, we've really been focusing on the role of higher education and what colleges and institutions in the states can do. But the question comes from Danielle, and it says, what role do you think K-12 will play in building a broader pipeline of students of color pursuing post-secondary pathways? And is there more that secondary leaders can and should be doing in terms of advising, support, and navigating the complex application process?
I mean, this is one of those implications of the decision, right? In that the decision itself leaves open consideration of race as students bring it up in their essays and they talk and connect it to their life experiences so that administrators and other faculty who are making these decisions can see how those experiences are aligned with the goals and mission of the institution. The implications for K-12 educators is that we really need to support guidance counselors in helping students articulate that for themselves, and that's a big effort, especially in the context where at least institutions in other states are facing constraints as to what they can even teach or to be able to name experiences and connected to systemic racism. So it is a big challenge, but I think one that we really need to focus our efforts in supporting K-12 educators to help students give voice to their experience.
The partnerships report highlights the importance of holding institutions publicly accountable for their concrete efforts to fulfill their pledges to maintain diversity. How do you advise institutions in terms of going public, given the protective stance to keep some efforts quiet to avoid litigation?
I mean, I think honestly, in this current environment, colleges and universities should maybe just take into account that they are likely to be sued. It's an unfortunate fact that there's so many of these anti-civil rights organizations that are looking to it. And I think sort of acknowledging that it might be something that happens and preparing for that as well as they can might hopefully make it a little bit less scary to announce policies and to put themselves out there in order to make the changes that they would need to increase diversity on their campuses. And I think at the end of the day, something that colleges and universities can think about is, how, as hard as it is for them to sort of speak out and make these changes and really commit to their goals for diversity, thinking about the effect that it has on their students. If they're scared to reach out to be advocates for diversity and talk about how important it is, how much harder is it for their students who have to live that reality every day on campuses that are not willing to speak out and support those students. And so sort of balancing those different interests and really thinking about, what can we do to protect ourselves on the legal front so that we are confident in our ability to stand up and advocate for these policies that we know are important, that we've talked about in our diversity missions.
Liliana, were you going to add anything?
No, I think those are really all important points. And, maybe, I don't know if Monty wants to add anything, because it's also so connected to students' experiences and, the care that is needed to support our students and to provide that high quality education for all.
I think for me, this goes back to the whole actions speak louder than words kind of thing. That the fact that some institutions would be willing to even receive some kind of lawsuit for wanting to increase diversity lets me know this is a place where I'm going to be welcome.
I want to ask this question that someone put in the Q&A. It says, they were asked, this is from a community college, they were asked by a vendor about regarding the process, whether it needs to change. He says, at our community college, we ask race ethnicity questions on our student applications. Obviously, we don't use this for admissions decision because we're an open admissions institution. Are we still able to ask for this info on our application, or should it be removed and asked on a different form after students are registered?
I mean, I'll say, so first and foremost, I definitely recommend that person reach out to their general counsel or other legal sources for actual legal advice. But I'll say in general, sort of as guidance, there's nothing in the opinion that sort of talks about what colleges and universities need to do in terms of that sort of racial and ethnic background data. I know that there are some colleges and universities that are in states where they're required to collect that data so they can use it as reporting for that state and other uses. And so it's really an individual, a look at your individual college's needs, what the state requires of you, and figuring out how to do it. But there's nothing specifically in the decision that says you cannot ever collect this data or look at it sort of generally. And again, for sort of more specifics about how that should look within your specific institution, I'd recommend you reach out to your general counsel on that issue.
There's a question in the chat regarding additional guidance from the administration. There was in the guidance and in the letter that they released yesterday or the day before, they did hint at a report that would be coming. So there will, I believe, be additional guidance coming from the administration around the decision. There's another question from Nadine Peacock. It says, I've heard that opponents of affirmative action are planning to monitor changes in composition of incoming student classes. And if they don't see a sharp decline in the proportion of students of color, they'll use that as evidence that institutions aren't adhering to the provisions of the decision and go after those institutions. This creates a very chilling climate and fosters overreaction. Is this something that folks have heard in the space, and how can institutions counteract? How can institutions counteract this?
I'll just say that that really goes to the heart of where institutions are finding themselves. I think And I just, before this webinar, I came from a meeting with my own institution and council and telling us about, how they're responding. And I think that it really names the reality that as long as we continue to have any kind of racial equity or continue to make progress, even if it's limited, institutions will face that threat of litigation. And it's a real bind, right? Like, we're trying to maintain and be successful in the aftermath of the decision, but as that success, if we are successful, it will just be used as a reason to base a challenge, saying that race continues to be impermissibly used. And as Maya pointed out before, like that is the reality. And I think to the extent that we can name it should help institutions. I think try not to act from that place of caution, but courage in that it is absolutely necessary.
I'll also just add that, not in any way like implying that any institution would do this, but there are other laws, the same sort of laws really that these organizations are using to try and prevent campuses from being diverse can also be, are typically used to prevent against racial discrimination. So institutions have to be careful sort of on the other side that they don't make changes to their policies and practices that end up discriminating against the exact groups that they're looking to help because of fears of litigation coming from, Ed Bloom and Students for Fair Admission. And so absolutely recognizing that this puts institutions in a bind. It's not a great environment for pushing for diversity, but there are organizations, mine included, they're going to be making sure that universities don't use this as an excuse or even inadvertently adopt policies and practices that are going to make it even harder. And I think sort of, again, accepting the reality that litigation is a much bigger risk now than maybe it was, preparing for that and moving forward with courage, as Liliana said, to continue to make the changes and focus on diversity because it's, the right thing to do.
I'll have, I think, what will be our final question. When we look at student to counselor ratios, it's roughly 420 to 1 across public schools. And my guess is it wouldn't be much better at community colleges. What kind of partnerships have you seen that work to support students on campuses in terms of navigating the application process and getting through, the FAFSA, financial aid forms? What have you seen that works, or what do we know in the literature that is effective in terms of creating those pipelines into higher education?
Well, I feel like here's where we get to turn that question back at you, given your expertise and knowledge, if you are comfortable really addressing.
I'm just the moderator, but I think there are policies, statewide policies. I would push for direct admissions as one of the policies that we should be looking at, especially in the state of Illinois. Illinois ran a pilot on it. Direct admissions effectively leverages the longitudinal data system of the state to automatically admit students from high school. And I believe you could use it also for community college students into 2- and 4-year institutions. So every graduating student, and if you do it effectively, for example, like Utah has done, they also remove the application fee. And so students don't have an application fee. There's not effectively an application. Every student gets admitted to 3 institutions. And so I think you could be using, which Illinois already has, FAFSA as a high school graduation requirement, along with a direct admissions approach to really, I think, create what I would call a universal access approach to higher education. You also need to fund institutions. So Illinois needs to do better at funding institutions and leverage, what they're looking at doing around outcomes-based funding, performance-based funding. So I do think there are statewide approaches, and also I think pathway approaches that states and institutions should be considering. I want to thank the panelists for taking time today. We've come to the end of the time. Thanks for your very thoughtful responses, and thank you. I'd like to thank everyone who joined us today in this conversation.